This week, something happened that almost nobody saw coming. Canada's largest city recorded the worst air quality of any major city on the entire planet. Worse than New Delhi, worse than Kinshasa, worse than Doha. And here is the part that will genuinely unsettle you. The fires causing it were burning hundreds of miles away in a forest almost nobody in that city will ever see with their own eyes. Stay with me for the next few minutes because I am going to walk you through exactly what is unfolding across Canada right now in July 2026. And by the end of this, you will understand something about this crisis that most headlines are completely missing. And hit subscribe before we go any further because this channel covers real ongoing disasters with verified numbers, not exaggerated panic. Let's start with where things actually stand today. According to the Canadian government's own official update released on July 9th, 2026, there are 796 active wildfires burning across the country at this very moment, and 60 of them are large enough or dangerous enough that they currently have full firefighting crews assigned and are still classified as out of control. Since the start of this year, Canada has already recorded 3,137 individual fires, which together have torn through roughly 1.44 million hectares of land, an area larger than the entire country of Jamaica. On its own, that already sounds like a genuinely alarming year. But here is the detail that completely reframes the whole story, and this is where it gets strange. By the exact same point last year in 2025, Canada had recorded fewer individual fires, only 2,913. But those fires had already burned through roughly 4.6 million hectares, more than 3 times the area burned so far in 2026. In other words, by the specific measurement scientists actually use to rank a fire season, total area burned, 2026 is currently running below the 5-year average. This year, at least so far, is technically a quieter one than last year. And that single fact is exactly why what is coming next matters so much. It helps to understand why total area burned, rather than simply the number of fires, is the measurement scientists actually rely on when they judge how serious a season really is. A season with a larger number of smaller fires can end up burning far less total land than a season with fewer but much larger and faster moving fires. Comparing 2026's 3,137 fires against 2025's 2,913 fires might make you think 2026 is the more active year, but the area burned tells the exact opposite story, since this year's fires have, on average, stayed considerably smaller or been contained more effectively than last year's. That distinction matters enormously for understanding the true severity of a season, and it is exactly why officials keep pointing to area burned rather than the raw fire count when explaining where 2026 currently sits. Now sit with that for a second, because it is the single most important thing to understand about this entire story. If a below-average season by that measurement already means 796 active fires, a major Canadian city posting the worst air quality on the planet, and provinces flooded with evacuees, then the actual ceiling for how bad this season could still get has not been tested yet. Not even close. And Environment and Climate Change Canada's own forecasters are predicting above-average temperatures across much of the country continuing from now through August. If a story built entirely on verified government numbers like that is what you want more of, go ahead and drop a like on this video because it genuinely helps this kind of careful reporting reach more people. Now let's talk about what has actually been happening on the ground this month, because mid-July 2026 has been genuinely dramatic, even within a below-average season overall. On July 15th and 16th, thick smoke from more than 100 active wildfires burning in northwestern Ontario poured south into Toronto, Canada's largest city, home to roughly 3 million people. Environment Canada issued an air quality warning as the smoky conditions rolled in overnight. And by around 8 o'clock the following morning, according to the Swiss air quality monitoring company IQ-Air, Toronto had the single worst air quality of any major city anywhere in the world, surpassing cities regularly associated with severe chronic air pollution, including New Delhi, Kinshasa, and Doha. An orange sky hung over the city's skyline. Visibility dropped noticeably, and the city of Toronto canceled or moved indoors its outdoor children's summer camp programs and closed outdoor public pools for the entire day. Environment Canada's Air Quality Health Index for the city reached a reading of 10 or higher that day, the classification used for what the agency calls very high-risk conditions, warning that the smoke posed a real danger to everyone exposed to it, regardless of age or existing health status. The following day, conditions improved only slightly. Toronto's air quality ranking dropped from worst in the world down to third worst globally on July 16th, according to the same tracking service, with the city's orange alert remaining in effect and outdoor pools staying closed for a second consecutive day. Environment Canada indicated conditions were expected to meaningfully improve by that Friday. Though local meteorologists warned residents that the smoke would not clear immediately and that symptoms like eye and throat irritation, headaches, or a mild cough could continue in the meantime, with anyone experiencing more serious symptoms like wheezing or chest pain urged to seek immediate medical attention. And here is where it gets worse. This smoke event arrived on top of an active heat dome already sitting over the region, stretching from southern Saskatchewan through Manitoba, across nearly the entire province of Ontario, and into Quebec. Toronto hit 33 degrees Celsius that day, feeling closer to 36 with the humidity factored in. That combination matters more than it might first appear, and I will come back to exactly why in a moment, because it creates a genuinely impossible situation for the most vulnerable people caught in the middle of it. The smoke did not stay contained to Toronto or even to Canada. Within the same window, it continued drifting south across the border, and within days, 3 major cities in the United States, including Chicago, found themselves ranked among the worst air quality readings anywhere in the world, according to the same tracking services. Environment agencies across the American Midwest and Northeast issued their own air quality warnings as the smoke plumes spread, with forecasters warning that the same haze could bring unhealthy air to millions more people across the Northeast and Midwest in the days that followed. This is now a well-established pattern rather than a one-time fluke. Smoke from Canadian wildfires crossing into the United States, and in some years reaching all the way across the Atlantic Ocean into Europe, has shown up repeatedly in recent fire seasons, and 2026 is continuing that same trend. It is worth explaining briefly why smoke from a remote Canadian forest fire can travel such an enormous distance and still cause real measurable harm thousands of kilometers away. Wildfire smoke, once it rises high enough into the atmosphere, gets picked up by upper-level wind patterns that can carry fine particulate matter across entire countries and in the right conditions across entire oceans over the course of just a few days. Unlike the visible flame and immediate destruction of a fire itself, which stays confined to the specific area actually burning, the smoke it produces recognizes no border, no city limit, and no international boundary. That is exactly why a fire burning in a nearly uninhabited stretch of northwestern Ontario forest can end up directly affecting the daily lives, health warnings, and outdoor plans of people living in Chicago, New York, or Boston, cities that will never see so much as a single flame from the actual source of the smoke drifting overhead. If you are the kind of person who wants to understand exactly why smoke from a fire hundreds of miles away can end up making your own city's air the worst on the planet for a day or two, drop a comment letting me know where you are watching from, because it genuinely helps me understand how far this story is actually reaching. Now here is where the picture gets uncomfortable. It is worth being precise about where this particular round of smoke actually came from, since the specific fires driving it are burning in a very sparsely populated part of the country. Fire officials reported roughly 148 active wildland fires burning across the northwestern region of Ontario as of mid-July, a remote area of dense boreal forest with very few roads and even fewer towns. Several of those fires prompted evacuation orders for First Nations communities in the area, communities that in many cases have no road access at all and depend entirely on aircraft for evacuation when a fire threatens. According to the most recent tracking available, as of July 17, 2026, 21 First Nations communities across the country have been affected by wildland fires this season, with 13 of them formally evacuated and roughly 2,182 individuals currently displaced from their homes as a direct result. Ontario alone accounts for the largest share of that impact, with 7 of its First Nations communities among those evacuated, while British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Quebec, and the Atlantic provinces each account for a smaller share of the remaining affected communities. It is worth pausing on that specific detail because it captures something important about how unevenly this kind of disaster actually lands. The overwhelming majority of people affected by wildfire smoke in Toronto and Chicago, in cities across the American Northeast, will never see an actual flame or lose their home. Their experience of this disaster is a smell in the air, a hazy orange sky, and a warning notification on their phone telling them to stay indoors for a day or two before conditions improve. Meanwhile, in a much smaller number of remote, often indigenous communities sitting directly in the path of these fires, the experience is completely different. An urgent evacuation by aircraft, an uncertain wait to find out whether a home still stands, and no real choice in the matter at all. Both experiences are part of the exact same wildfire season, but they could not look more different from the ground. That gap in experience is not new, and it reflects a pattern that shows up in nearly every serious Canadian wildfire season. Federal and provincial governments have specifically acknowledged this ongoing vulnerability, and recent funding announcements tied to this wildfire season include dedicated projects with Métis Nation governments across British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario aimed at strengthening wildfire preparedness through better risk mapping, emergency planning, and evacuation coordination that specifically incorporates Indigenous knowledge of the land. Additional federal investment has gone toward training dozens of new Indigenous wildland firefighters in communities like those served by the Decho-Goteen government and the Chipewyan Prairie First Nation, an effort to build more local firefighting capacity directly within the communities most frequently and most severely affected by these fires, rather than relying entirely on crews and resources sent in from elsewhere once a fire has already grown dangerous. It is also worth understanding honestly and directly why hundreds of fires can be burning at once without every single one of them being actively fought. When officials describe a fire as out of control, that specific formal designation does not necessarily mean firefighters have given up or that the situation is being ignored. In many cases, it means a fire is burning in terrain with no roads, no easy water access, and no way to safely land equipment or crews, which forces fire agencies into a genuine triage situation. Crews are deployed to defend the fires that directly threaten towns, communities, and human lives, while fires burning through genuinely empty backcountry are in many cases simply monitored rather than directly fought, because there is no safe or practical way to reach them at all. In those cases, only a real shift in the weather, cooler temperatures, higher humidity, or meaningful rainfall will actually slow them down. When a formal government count says 60 fires currently have full response and remain out of control, that number reflects the fires serious and accessible enough to warrant that level of committed firefighting resources, not necessarily every single fire currently burning across the country. If that distinction between letting a fire burn and actually losing control of the situation surprised you, drop a comment and let me know, because it is exactly the kind of nuance that tends to get lost once a story like this turns into a quick headline. There is also flooding complicating this picture in parts of the country right now, which is easy to overlook in a story that is otherwise entirely about fire and smoke. Manitoba, in particular the Parkland region, has been dealing with intense storms and heavy rainfall in recent weeks, serious enough that the federal government approved a formal request for emergency flooding assistance from the province in early July 2026. That means some of the same provinces currently battling wildfire, smoke, and evacuations are simultaneously managing an entirely separate flooding emergency, a reminder that a genuinely difficult season rarely arrives as just one single type of disaster. Now let's talk about the smoke itself for a moment, because the actual physical danger it carries is not the part you can see or smell. The specific pollutant that matters most in wildfire smoke is called particulate matter 2.5, meaning fine particles, roughly 2.5 micrometers across, or smaller, about 1/30th the width of a single human hair. These tiny particles make up around 90% of the total particle mass a wildfire releases into the air, and their size is exactly what makes them so dangerous. The human body has natural defenses against larger dust and debris, the nose and throat filtering out bigger particles before they ever reach anywhere important. Particulate matter, this small, slips straight past those defenses, traveling deep into the smallest airways of the lungs and from there directly into the bloodstream. That is the entire reason a barely visible haze outside your window is a genuine physiological event, not just a visual inconvenience. Short-term exposure can trigger asthma attacks, acute bronchitis, eye and throat irritation, and can meaningfully raise the risk of respiratory infection. For people with existing heart or lung conditions, it can push an already strained system past a dangerous threshold. And health researchers have documented measurable spikes in emergency room visits and hospital admissions in the days immediately following a serious smoke event like this one. There is research suggesting wildfire smoke may actually be more harmful particle for particle than the everyday pollution most city dwellers are used to breathing from cars and industrial sources. Some research measuring hospital admissions has found respiratory cases rising by somewhere between roughly 1% and as much as 10% for every additional 10 micrograms per cubic meter of wildfire-specific particulate matter in the air, a notably steeper increase than the same concentration of typical urban pollution tends to produce. One proposed explanation involves the specific chemistry of wildfire smoke itself, which appears to generate more free radicals once inhaled, driving greater inflammation and oxidative stress in lung tissue compared to more familiar sources of urban air pollution. In practical terms, that means the same numerical air quality reading during a wildfire smoke event may carry a somewhat higher real-world health risk than an identical reading caused by ordinary traffic pollution on a calm summer day, which is exactly why health agencies tend to issue especially direct urgent warnings specifically during wildfire smoke events, rather than treating every type of poor air quality identically. It also helps to correct a common, understandable assumption people make about this kind of smoke. Many people assume that if they cannot smell smoke, the air outside must be safe, and that once the smell fades, the danger has passed. Neither of those assumptions is reliable. The smallest, most damaging particles do not always announce themselves clearly through smell, which is exactly why health agencies consistently advise people to check an actual air quality index reading rather than trust their own nose. A day that looks like nothing more than an ordinary pale haze can still be carrying enough fine particulate matter to send genuinely vulnerable people to the hospital. And here is the part almost nobody talks about. There is a specific difficult overlap worth understanding because it directly affects how people are supposed to protect themselves. During a heat wave on its own, standard health advice is to open windows at night and let air circulate to help cool a home down. During a smoke event on its own, the advice is essentially the opposite. Seal up the house, keep windows and doors closed, and run air conditioning on a recirculating setting to keep outside air out entirely. When a heat dome and a wildfire smoke event hit the exact same region at the same time, as happened in Toronto and across much of southern Ontario this past week, the same vulnerable populations facing both warnings are left with two pieces of advice that directly contradict each other. An elderly resident without reliable air conditioning choosing between a stifling sealed apartment and an open window that lets smoke pour in is facing a genuinely impossible no-win situation. Health officials handling this exact overlap have generally advised prioritizing whichever risk is more immediately dangerous in a given moment, which in practice usually means keeping windows closed and running air conditioning if it is available, since heat exhaustion and heat stroke tend to develop more slowly and are somewhat easier to manage with hydration and cooling centers than the immediate respiratory strain caused by heavy smoke inhalation. Cities dealing with this overlap, including Toronto during this exact stretch of July 2026, have opened designated cooling centers specifically designed to offer relief from both hazards simultaneously. Air-conditioned indoor spaces with filtered air, giving residents without adequate cooling or air filtration at home somewhere safer to spend the worst hours of a combined heat and smoke event. That specific overlap, extreme heat and heavy wildfire smoke arriving together, has become an increasingly familiar feature of recent Canadian and American summers, rather than a rare coincidence. And now we need to address something you have probably already seen circulating online. It is worth directly confronting something that tends to spread every time a wildfire season becomes this serious, because it deserves a clear, honest answer rather than being ignored. Every major fire season now brings along a wave of claims suggesting the fires were set deliberately, sometimes framed as a coordinated arson campaign, and in stranger versions framed around some kind of directed energy weapon. The honest, grounded answer here separates a small grain of truth from a much larger fantasy. Individual fires do sometimes have human causes, and arson is a real documented phenomenon in some cases. But a continent-scale wildfire season involving hundreds of simultaneous ignitions spread across thousands of kilometers of largely roadless northern forest is simply not something a person with a lighter or any small group of people could realistically produce. The genuine drivers here are lightning strikes, extremely dry fuel built up from prolonged drought conditions, and strong shifting winds. The ordinary, well-understood physics of hot, parched terrain meeting an ignition source. There is no credible evidence of any exotic or deliberate ignition mechanism behind this season, and frankly, none is actually needed to explain what sustained heat and dryness are already fully capable of doing on their own. It is also worth understanding why this particular kind of claim tends to resurface so reliably every single fire season, regardless of which specific country or region is affected. A wildfire season involving hundreds of fires burning simultaneously across a vast, largely unpopulated stretch of forest is understandably difficult for most people to picture unfolding naturally, since very few of us ever witness lightning igniting dry brush firsthand, or have a clear sense of just how quickly bone-dry vegetation can catch and spread under the right combination of heat, wind, and drought. That gap between lived experience and the actual physical scale of a boreal forest fire season creates fertile ground for alternative explanations to take hold, even when the genuine scientifically documented cause, a very hot, very dry summer meeting an enormous stretch of naturally flammable forest, is already more than sufficient to explain everything being observed. So where does this leave things heading into the rest of the summer? Canada is currently managing a wildfire season that is technically below average by the main scientific measurement used to rank fire severity, total area burned. And yet that same below average season has already produced the worst air quality reading of any major city on the planet, forced evacuations across multiple provinces and numerous First Nations communities, and pushed smoke across an international border into major American cities within the same week. Government forecasters are explicitly warning that hotter, drier conditions are expected to continue through August, particularly across Manitoba, northwestern Ontario, and much of western Canada. Nobody currently studying this data claims the season is guaranteed to reach the extraordinary levels of 2023, which remains Canada's worst fire season on record, or 2025, which also produced dramatically larger total area burned than what has occurred so far in 2026. What the numbers do show clearly is that the underlying ingredients, sustained heat, widespread dryness, and hundreds of active ignition points remain firmly in place, and the season still has a considerable stretch of its highest risk period still ahead of it. Then in 2025, Canada recorded another genuinely extraordinary season with total area burned reaching roughly 4.6 million hectares by the same point in July, more than 3 times what has burned so far in 2026. 2 record scale or near record scale seasons occurring within a 3-year window is exactly the pattern sitting behind why forecasters are treating this year's below average numbers with real caution rather than relief. The concern voiced by officials is not that 2026 has already matched those 2 previous extraordinary years, since by the numbers it clearly has not, at least not yet. The concern is how quickly a below average season can flip into something something far more serious once sustained heat and dryness fully arrive on the schedule forecasters are currently describing for the remainder of July and all of August. There are a few specific things worth watching closely over the coming weeks if you want to understand whether this season is stabilizing or accelerating. Keep an eye on whether the total number of out-of-control fires with full response climbs meaningfully above that current figure of 60, since that number reflects fires serious enough to require dedicated crews rather than simple monitoring. Watch how long any given smoke episode lingers over major cities and how far it travels, since both the duration and the reach of these events have been extending in recent years rather than shrinking. And watch the temperature and drought forecasts specifically for Western Canada, since British Columbia, Alberta, and the Northwest Territories have already been flagged by federal forecasters as carrying the highest ongoing risk heading into the hottest stretch of the summer. If you want to keep following this story with real verified numbers rather than exaggerated claims, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because the situation across Canada is still actively developing, and the next several weeks of hot, dry weather will likely determine whether this stays a below average year or turns into something considerably more serious. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.